On Christmas morning, my daughter pressed a broom into my hands and sneered, "Clean up, that's all you're good for." The room laughed, but I stayed silent, because I knew something they didn't. Within the hour, the police would prove the house they called theirs was mine. My name is Clara Whitfield, and I am 72 years old. I was a school teacher for 40 years, a wife for nearly 50, and a mother for every second of my life. I buried my husband, Harold, 7 winters ago, and in the silence that followed, I believed moving in with my daughter would be a comfort. Family, after all, is supposed to be a shelter. But sometimes, family can be a storm that tears you down faster than any stranger ever could. When Harold passed, I told myself Linda, my only daughter, would want me close. She was always so full of life growing up, a bright little girl with pigtails who used to leave me handwritten notes in my classroom desk drawer. "I love you, Mama," she'd scrawl in crayon. I saved those notes in a shoebox that still sits under my bed. Back then, her love was as certain as sunrise. Back then, I never imagined she'd see me as a burden. When I moved into her home 3 years ago, I thought I was giving her a gift, too. She had 2 young children, a busy job, and a husband whose ambition seemed to swallow his time. I imagined myself helping, baking cookies with the kids, telling bedtime stories, keeping the house alive with the warmth only a grandmother can bring. For a while, that's what I tried to do. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. My helping hands became expected hands. My presence became inconvenient. It started subtly. Linda asking me to fold laundry while she was out. Mark, my son-in-law, asking if I could keep busy tidying the garage. Then, over time, it grew bolder. My meals were cooked, but left to cool while everyone else ate together. My chair was pushed to the corner, my voice drowned out in conversations. Mark's jokes about having a live-in maid became sharper, less like humor and more like truth. I swallowed it all. I told myself, family is family, and sometimes we must bend. But that Christmas morning, when Linda's words fell like stones on my chest, I felt something inside me tighten. I gripped that broom, and for the first time, I didn't see myself as powerless. I saw a woman who had given everything, her youth, her strength, her years, to raise a daughter who now saw her as nothing. I wasn't nothing. The house buzzed with holiday energy. Grandchildren squealed over presents, ribbons tangled underfoot, and Mark sat in his recliner, scrolling on his phone as though none of it mattered. Linda flitted around like a hostess on display, her voice sharp as bells as she directed everyone, but never once included me. I carried the broom into the hallway, away from the laughter, and let my hands rest against its handle. My eyes traveled along the walls. Photographs of family, vacations, school portraits, smiling faces. My face was there too, but always in the background, the edges, as though I'd already been erased. But there was something Linda and Mark didn't know, something I had carried quietly all these years, folded away like those crayon letters in the shoebox. This house, the very one I stood in, the one filled with mocking laughter and false cheer, was not theirs. It was mine. My husband and I had bought it decades ago when Linda was still in college. We'd planned it as a legacy, a family home that could shelter generations. When Harold died, I never transferred the deed. I told myself there was time. But time has a way of revealing people's truths. And that morning, I realized silence had become my weapon, and patience had become my shield. I didn't speak when she shoved that broom into my hands. I didn't argue when Mark smirked as if I were less than nothing. But in my heart, a thought bloomed, steady and clear. They have no idea what's coming, because in just 1 hour, the knock on the door would shatter their illusion. The clatter of dishes and the sharp squeal of children's laughter filled the air, the kind of chaotic noise that usually made a house feel alive. But that morning, the sounds only made me feel smaller, pressed into a corner of a home that was supposed to be mine. Linda was in her element, her hair curled perfectly, her sweater shining with sequins that caught the tree lights. She moved around the room like a conductor, directing her family as though Christmas was a performance and she was the star. "Mark, pass me that platter. Kids, don't rip the wrapping too fast. We need pictures." Her voice carried authority, and the others obeyed without question. Me, I was invisible. I had tried to make myself useful earlier that morning. I rose before dawn, crept into the kitchen, and baked cinnamon rolls the way Harold used to like them, soft in the middle, glazed with a touch of vanilla. The smell carried through the house, and for a moment I thought maybe Linda would smile and say, "Thanks, Mom. I remember these." Instead, she wrinkled her nose when she saw the pan. "Mom, we don't need all that sugar around. The kids have enough junk." She slid the tray to the back of the counter like it was an embarrassment. I said nothing, just wiped my hands on my apron and stepped aside. An hour later, she shoved the broom into my hands. "Clean up, that's all you're good for." Her words were casual, tossed off as though they were nothing more than air, but they landed heavy, each syllable burning its way into my chest. Mark chuckled from his recliner. "Better keep her busy, huh?" he said, his eyes still glued to his phone. The children, caught in that strange place between loyalty and discomfort, giggled nervously and then quickly buried themselves back into their gifts. I stood still for a long moment, staring down at the broom. The handle felt rough in my hands, splintered from years of use. My knuckles trembled, not from weakness, but from restraint. It would have been easy to throw it down, to shout, to remind them who I was. But silence has a sharpness they had never learned to fear. I walked slowly to the hallway, each step echoing the truth I held close. This is my house. Mine, not theirs. In the corner by the tree, I caught sight of Linda smiling for a picture with her children. Her arm wrapped tight around them, her face radiant with the joy of appearances. Anyone looking at her would think she was the perfect mother, the perfect hostess. And maybe, once upon a time, I would have believed that too. But now I saw what lay beneath: the hunger for control, the desire to be seen, even if it meant stepping on me to shine brighter. As I swept, I let my mind drift back to Christmases past. I remembered Linda as a child, her eyes wide as Harold strung lights across the porch. I remembered her clutching my hand as we sang carols, her voice high and sweet. I remembered the way she used to whisper, "Don't ever leave me, Mama." The ache in my chest grew sharper with each memory. Where had that little girl gone? Now she barely looked at me unless it was to give an order. I brushed a pile of torn wrapping paper into a heap, listening to Linda chatter about the new SUV she and Mark wanted to buy in the spring. "We'll make it work," she said confidently. "After all, this house is ours. We'll manage." Her words made me pause, the broom still in my hand. Ours. I almost smiled at the irony. She spoke as if she held the deed in her pocket, as if my years of sacrifice, of saving every penny with Harold, meant nothing. My silence wasn't weakness. It was a shield. Because what she didn't know was that every word she spoke only built the case against her. Mark raised his glass of champagne, toasting the morning. To family, to our home, to the future. Everyone cheered except me. I leaned on the broom and whispered under my breath, "Careful what you claim, Mark. Some things aren't yours to toast." I glanced toward the clock on the wall. Barely an hour had passed since Linda's words sliced through me like knives. The morning wasn't over, but neither was my silence. Somewhere deep in my bones, I felt a shift, as if Harold himself was standing behind me, steadying me with the quiet strength he always carried. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to fight them in front of their guests. All I had to do was wait, because the truth, cold, unshakable, written in ink on paper locked in my desk upstairs, was about to knock on the door. And when it did, Linda and Mark's laughter would turn to ash in their throats. As I swept the last of the torn wrapping paper into the dustpan, my mind betrayed me with memories. Christmas mornings used to look so different. Back then, my husband Harold and I would stay up late on Christmas Eve, wrapping gifts in the dim glow of the tree lights while Linda pretended to sleep upstairs. I still remember the sound of her feet padding across the hallway, her tiny giggle giving her away as she peeked through the banister. She'd come running down at dawn, pigtails bouncing, her eyes wide with wonder, as if the world had unfolded just for her. "Don't forget the stockings, Mama," she used to squeal. Harold would scoop her up and pretend to hide the gifts behind his back, and Linda would laugh so hard her little shoulders shook. Those mornings were pure magic. They were the kind of memories that made every sacrifice worth it. I worked hard to give her everything. I was a school teacher by day, a tutor in the evenings, and sometimes a seamstress at night just to make sure Linda had the opportunities she deserved. When she wanted piano lessons, I pinched pennies until we could afford them. When she begged to go on the school trip to Washington, D.C., I sold Harold's old tools to make it happen. I never let her see the cracks in our budget or the exhaustion in my body. I wanted her to believe in abundance, in possibility. She was a good child, too. Or at least, she used to be. She would sit at the kitchen table while I graded papers, drawing me pictures of houses with hearts in the windows. "This is us, Mama," she'd say, holding up the paper proudly. "Always together." I kept those drawings tucked inside my dresser, right next to her first report cards and the crayon letters she'd slip into my desk drawer at school. So how did we end up here? I asked myself that as I stood in her house, broom in hand, reduced to the role of maid. Was it Mark's influence? He had a way of puffing up her ego, always talking about how much she deserved more, how other people were jealous of her success. Or was it the world itself? The endless scroll of social media, the hunger for more, the belief that appearances were worth more than substance? Maybe it was simply time. Time changes people. Sometimes it reveals their best, sometimes their worst. I remember the first time I noticed the shift in her tone. It was a year after Harold died. I had just moved in. Linda had asked me to pick up her dry cleaning while she worked late. When I forgot, she snapped, "You can't just sit around all day, Mom. You should at least make yourself useful." That word, useful, stuck with me. I wasn't her mother anymore. I was a tool, an extra pair of hands to lighten her load. But here's the truth she never understood. Usefulness fades, dignity doesn't. I thought about Harold often during these moments. He had been a quiet man, steady and kind, the sort who believed respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you lived by. He used to say, "Clara, storms don't scare me. People who forget where they come from do." I didn't realize then how prophetic those words were. Linda forgot. She forgot the late nights I spent sewing her dresses. She forgot the meals I skipped so she could have seconds. She forgot the woman who sat in the front row of every recital, every graduation, every milestone. And maybe that's what hurt most. Not the broom in my hands, not the laughter at my expense, but the forgetting. I paused by the window, watching the snow fall softly outside. Children's laughter echoed from the living room, their innocence untouched by the venom of adulthood. They were too young to understand the cruelty of their mother's words, though I feared one day they'd learn it from her example. I whispered to myself, I gave her everything, and now she gives me nothing but shame. But even as the bitterness pressed against my chest, there was something else beneath it, a seed of resolve. I wasn't a fool. I wasn't broken. I wasn't disposable. Linda thought she had erased me from the center of this home, but the truth was that the foundation of this house, brick, beam, and paper, still bore my name. Every laugh that rang through the hallways, every photo hung on the walls, every holiday feast, it all rested on ground I had laid. They could mock me, belittle me, treat me as less than, but they could not take away what was mine. And in that moment, with the snow falling and the broom steady in my hands, I knew Harold would have told me to wait, to let them show their true colors, to let the weight of their arrogance crush them when the truth finally surfaced. I breathed deeply and pressed the memory of Linda's childhood smile against the ache in my heart. That little girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had forgotten gratitude, who saw her mother as an inconvenience rather than the reason she stood where she did. But I would not forget who I was, and soon neither would she. I carried the broom back to its corner and leaned it gently against the wall. My daughter's laughter spilled into the hallway, sharp and bright, as if nothing in the world could touch her. For a moment I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me, not as a mother hearing her child's joy, but as a woman recognizing arrogance for what it was. They thought I was powerless here. They thought I stayed under their roof because I had nowhere else to go. But that was the illusion I had allowed them to believe. Sometimes silence, I've learned, is not weakness, it's strategy. Because the truth was simple. The house they lived in, the one Linda boasted about to neighbors and Mark paraded as his own, wasn't theirs. It never had been. Decades ago, when Harold and I were younger and still brimming with hope for the future, we purchased this house. It wasn't grand back then, just a modest home with a tired roof and a backyard full of weeds. But Harold saw potential. He spent weekends fixing the porch, patching drywall, replacing floorboards until it gleamed. I spent evenings planting roses, coaxing life into the soil until the yard bloomed with color. When Linda graduated college, she moved in while we imagined it would always be a place she could return to, a home base for her family, a shelter against the storms of life. That was our dream, Harold's and mine, a legacy, not just of brick and wood, but of love and security. But when Harold died, I never changed the papers. The deed stayed in my name, tucked away in a folder with birth certificates, marriage licenses, and the worn photos we'd carried across 40 years. Linda never asked about it. She simply assumed that because she lived here with her husband, because she paid for renovations or furniture, the house was hers. Assumption is a dangerous thing. I let her believe it. I let Mark swagger around telling friends it was his property. I let neighbors nod along when Linda bragged about her house. Every word they spoke, every boast they made, only cemented the truth I kept hidden in the quiet of my room. And why? Because sometimes people must reveal who they truly are before justice can find them. I thought back to a week earlier when Linda had snapped at me for leaving the porch light on. "Do you know how much electricity costs?" she scolded. "This isn't your place to waste." The words had stung, but I had simply nodded. I hadn't reminded her that my signature was the one that had closed the deal decades ago, or that the utility bill still came addressed to me. No, I saved that truth, tucked it away like a knife hidden in cloth, waiting for the moment it would be needed. Mark was the worst of it. He spoke with the smugness of a man who believed he owned more than just walls and land. He believed he owned authority. He treated me like an unwanted tenant, muttering about how old people drag everyone down. He'd once joked to a friend on the phone that if I kicked the bucket, at least they'd finally get the house fully in their name. I had stood in the hallway that night, the words clinging to me like frost. My fingers had itched to grab the deed and wave it in his face. But Harold's voice whispered in my mind, "Wait, Clara. Truth always has its hour." And that hour was near. Because Christmas morning wasn't just another day of mockery. It was a line in the sand. When Linda shoved that broom into my hands, I felt Harold's steady hand on my shoulder. I felt the years of sacrifice, the weight of motherhood, the sting of betrayal all converge into one clear thought. Enough. Upstairs in the drawer of my nightstand sat the folder. Inside was the deed, crisp though yellowed at the edges, with my name written in careful ink. My name, not Linda's, not Mark's, mine. The walls they decorated, the kitchen they remodeled, the bedrooms where my grandchildren slept, all of it rested on my paper, my rights, my sacrifices. I had never intended to use it against them. I thought love would be enough, that one day they'd look at me not as a burden, but as the woman who had built their foundation. But love had withered in this house, smothered by entitlement, and where love dies, truth must rise. I walked slowly back into the living room. The children were squealing over toys, paper and ribbons scattered like confetti. Linda was posing for photos, her smile polished, her eyes darting occasionally toward me to make sure I was out of the way. Mark lounged in his chair, legs stretched, glass in hand. I sat quietly on the edge of the couch, watching them, holding my silence like armor. They thought I had nothing left, but I knew better. Because in just 1 hour, when the knock came at the door, their kingdom built on assumption would collapse, and the deed, my deed, would speak louder than any insult, louder than any broom shoved into my hands. The house grew louder as more guests arrived, neighbors dropping in with trays of cookies, Linda's friends bringing bottles of wine wrapped in red foil. The living room swelled with chatter and laughter, the tree lights flickering across glasses raised in cheer. To anyone walking in, it looked like the picture of a happy family. But from where I stood, broom in hand, it felt like I was watching a play from backstage, present, yet never meant to be seen. Linda's voice rang out above the noise. "Everyone, make yourselves at home. Mark and I are so glad you could celebrate Christmas with us." With us. Not once did she acknowledge me. I might as well have been part of the wallpaper. I set the broom aside, hoping to slip quietly into a chair near the corner. But just as I sat, Linda swooped over, her sequined sweater catching the light like armor. "Mom, not there. Guests will need the seats. Maybe stand in the kitchen for now?" Her words were coated in a sugary smile meant to disguise the sting. The neighbor standing beside her gave me a puzzled glance. "Clara, why don't you sit with us? It's Christmas." Linda's jaw tightened, but she laughed it off. "Oh, you know, Mom. She likes to keep busy." And with that, she pressed an empty tray into my hands. "Can you refill the appetizers? We're running low." The humiliation was sharp, but I held my tongue. The tray was cold against my palms, but inside, something hotter stirred. A quiet burn, steady and controlled. As I moved toward the kitchen, I overheard Mark talking to one of his friends near the fireplace. "It's a great house," he said, puffing his chest. "Ours now, of course. Linda's parents left it to us." His friend whistled. "Lucky. That must save a fortune." Mark grinned. "Yeah, well, the old woman still hangs around, but what can you do? She's harmless." I paused, just out of sight. The tray balanced in my hands. Harmless. The word rang in my ears like an insult and a dare all at once. They saw me as nothing more than a shadow, an aging ghost clinging to the corners of their home. I wanted to walk out right then, slam the door, and never return. But instead, I steadied my breath. Harold's voice echoed in my memory. Let them talk. "Clara, a man's lies are often the rope he uses to hang himself." So I said nothing. Back in the kitchen, I refilled the tray with crackers and cheese, my hands steady even as my chest ached. Through the doorway, I could see Linda laughing with her guests, head tilted back, basking in their admiration. Every word she spoke seemed rehearsed, how she managed the household, how she balanced work and motherhood, how proud she was of the home they had built. Not once did she mention the woman standing in the kitchen, the one who had built the foundation for all of it. A neighbor, Mrs. Taylor, caught my eye when I returned with the tray. She was a kind woman, a few years younger than me, with soft gray hair and the sort of eyes that saw more than people wanted. As I set the tray down, she leaned close and whispered, "Strange, isn't it? They act like this place isn't still yours." Her words almost made me stumble. I glanced at her, startled, but she just gave a small, knowing smile. "We all remember, Clara. Your name is still on the papers. Don't let them forget it." I gave her a tight nod, my throat too tight for words. That whisper was enough to steady me, enough to remind me I wasn't crazy. I wasn't invisible, not to everyone. Later, as glasses clinked and toasts were made, Linda called out, "To family and to our home." She raised her glass high, her guests echoing the cheer. All eyes turned to her, admiration shining, while I stood by the doorway holding an empty plate. Mark smirked at me, lifting his own glass in mock acknowledgement, as if to say, "Look at you, servant in your own house." The room erupted in laughter, but I didn't join. I never did. I simply stood still, letting the noise wash over me, letting the weight of their arrogance pile higher and higher. They thought they were untouchable, safe in the fortress of lies they had built. But I knew the truth, and truth, when revealed, doesn't whisper. It roars. I straightened my shoulders and quietly left the room, heading upstairs to my bedroom. In the drawer of my nightstand, the folder lay waiting, its edges worn from decades of keeping. I didn't take it out yet. I simply rested my hand on it, feeling the power in its weight. Downstairs, their laughter grew louder. But in my chest, the silence felt stronger than any cheer. The boiling point had come, and soon the steam would escape. The evening carried on, laughter swelling and voices overlapping until the living room felt heavy with heat and noise. The children darted around the tree, their little feet scattering ribbons and bows across the carpet I had vacuumed that very morning. I watched from the edge of the kitchen, invisible to most, but not to all. Mrs. Taylor caught my eye again from across the room. She was perched on the sofa beside her husband, her gaze flicking between Linda's sparkling performance and my quiet stillness in the corner. I saw her lips press into a thin line each time Linda boasted, each time Mark claimed something as his own. It was Mark who filled the air most of all. He was a man who thrived on an audience, and tonight, with wine in his glass and admiration in the room, he was louder than ever. "Remodeled the kitchen last spring," he bragged to one of the neighbors. "Cost a fortune, but worth every penny. Makes this place feel like a palace." The neighbor nodded politely, though I saw his eyes flicker toward me, standing quietly near the counter. He knew. Many of them did. "And the mortgage?" another asked. Mark waved a hand. "All squared away, don't worry. This house is ours, free and clear. Linda's parents made sure of that." His words were slick, rehearsed, but they twisted something inside me. Harold and I had worked decades for this house, through late nights, through sickness, through lean years where we counted coins for groceries. To hear Mark toss it into conversation like a trinket, like a gift casually handed to them, made my stomach tighten. Linda chimed in then, laughing. "Yes, we're lucky, aren't we? Not everyone has the security we do. This house, it's our pride. Our pride. My pride. Harold's pride. The foundation of our lives, reduced to a line in her performance." I forced my lips into a small smile, but my heart ached. Mrs. Taylor leaned over to her husband, not quite whispering, but not loud enough to be bold either. "Funny, isn't it?" she murmured. "Clara's name is still on the deed. I saw it myself when the county records came through last year." Her husband gave a short nod, his eyes darting to me in quiet acknowledgement. A few others, sitting closer, overheard and shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The ripple of doubt spread just beneath the surface of the party's cheer. Linda didn't notice. She was too busy posing for photographs, her arm looped through Mark's, their smiles practiced and polished. Mark, on the other hand, noticed everything, or at least he noticed me standing silent in the kitchen doorway. He raised his glass in my direction, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "To our generous matriarch," he said loudly, the room turning toward me. "Without you, Clara, none of this would have been possible. And without us, well, you'd probably just be in some retirement home by now." The laughter came in waves, some genuine, some hesitant, some nervous. My face burned, but I didn't lower my eyes. I met his stare and held it, my silence steady, unflinching. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression. An unease, perhaps, or the faint realization that I wasn't as fragile as he wanted to believe. But then he laughed again, slapping a neighbor on the back, the moment gone. Inside, though, something shifted. Their arrogance had always been cruel, but now it was public. They weren't just mocking me in whispers. They were parading me as an object of pity, a burden to be endured. And the more they spoke, the more the truth sharpened in my chest like a blade waiting to be drawn. I turned back to the kitchen, my hands steady as I gathered empty glasses. I caught Mrs. Taylor's gaze once more, and this time her eyes softened with something close to encouragement. It was as if she was saying, "Don't let them erase you." I gave her the smallest nod. The night stretched on, each boast, each jab, each false claim, weaving itself tighter into a net they didn't even realize they were caught in. Upstairs, the folder waited. The deed, the proof, the anchor of truth. Downstairs, the house swelled with arrogance, ignorance, and assumption. And I, quiet, steady, invisible only by choice, stood in the middle, holding silence like a weapon. Because soon, silence would break. And when it did, every neighbor, every guest, every child in that room would see the truth. The clock struck noon, and the air inside the house had grown thick with heat from too many bodies and too much wine. Children's squeals mixed with bursts of adult laughter. But beneath it all, I felt a heaviness settle, a drumbeat of something inevitable drawing closer. I was carrying another tray of empty glasses into the kitchen when it happened. A sudden knock at the door, firm, steady. Too deliberate to be a neighbor dropping by with cookies. The sound cut through the laughter like a blade. The room went still for just a moment before Linda, ever the hostess, called out brightly, "Mark, can you get that?" Mark grumbled but rose, swaggering toward the front door. He swung it open with the careless confidence of a man who believed the world bent to him. But the sight that greeted him made his expression falter. 2 uniformed police officers stood on the porch, snowflakes dusting their shoulders. Their expressions were calm, professional, but their presence carried weight, the kind of weight that presses silence into a room full of people. "Good afternoon," one of them said. "We're here to speak with Mrs. Clara Whitfield." The name echoed through the house like a bell toll. For a moment, no one moved. Then all eyes turned to me, standing at the edge of the kitchen doorway with a dishcloth in my hands. Linda blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "You mean my mother?" She forced a laugh, nervous and high-pitched. "Is something wrong? She hasn't done anything, has she?" The officer shook his head. "No, ma'am. We just need to confirm a few things with Mrs. Whitfield regarding this property." This property. The words sank into the air, heavy and unmistakable. Guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Linda, Mark, and me. I walked slowly forward, my back straight, the dishcloth folded neatly in my hands. "I'm Clara," I said, my voice steady. "How can I help you, officers?" Mark's brow furrowed, his bravado slipping. "Wait a second, what's this about? This is our house. Why would you need to speak to her about it?" The officer glanced at him but kept his tone polite. "Sir, according to the records we have on file, the property deed lists Mrs. Clara Whitfield as the sole owner. We've been asked to verify that information." The silence that followed was electric. Linda's face drained of color. That can't be right," she stammered. "This is our home. My husband and I, we've been living here, paying for renovations, raising our children here. The deed should be in my name." The officer's expression didn't waver. "I understand, ma'am, but the county records are very clear. Unless there's been a legal transfer, which there hasn't, the ownership remains with Mrs. Whitfield." The room buzzed with whispers now, neighbors leaning toward one another, eyes wide. Mrs. Taylor's lips pressed together in the faintest hint of a smile. Mark stepped forward, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. She's just some old woman. We've been running this place for years. Clearly, there's some mistake." I let him rant. I stood still, my hands folded over the dishcloth, my face calm. Inside, though, my heart beat steady with vindication. Years of silence, years of humiliation, years of being treated like a burden. And now the truth was being spoken aloud, not by me, but by the law itself. I turned my gaze toward Linda. Her sequined sweater glittered under the tree lights, but her face was pale, her lips trembling as though she had been caught in a lie she couldn't untangle. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, no words coming. Finally, she whispered, "Mom? Why didn't you ever tell us?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I could have answered. I could have told her about the nights Harold and I spent building this home from nothing, about the sacrifices we made, about the deed I kept safe all these years. I could have told her that I wanted to believe love was stronger than paper, but instead I simply said, "Because I wanted to see who you'd become when you thought I had nothing." The room froze. Even the children quieted, sensing the shift. The officers exchanged a glance. Then one of them said, "We'll leave you to sort this out, but the records are accurate. Mrs. Whitfield, if you'd like copies of the documentation, you can request them through the county office." I nodded, my voice soft but certain. "Thank you, officers. That won't be necessary. I already have them." As they left, the murmurs rose again. Guests looked at Linda and Mark with new eyes, not with admiration, but with judgment. The perfect image Linda had worked so hard to create had cracked, the truth spilling through like light through broken glass. I stood in the center of the room, no longer invisible, no longer silenced, and for the first time in years, it was Linda who looked small. The door clicked shut behind the officers, and for a long moment no one spoke. The party's cheer had drained away, replaced with a silence so thick you could hear the faint hum of the heater in the background. Linda stood stiff near the tree, her sequined sweater catching the light in a way that now looked garish rather than glamorous. Her friends avoided her eyes, suddenly fascinated with the floor, their glasses, anything but her. Mark shifted his weight from one foot to the other, jaw clenched, the smirk he wore all evening gone. And me? I felt no need to rush. I turned slowly and began walking toward the staircase. Every eye followed me. My slippers made soft sounds against the hardwood as I climbed each step, steady and unhurried, as though I had rehearsed this moment my whole life. In my room, I opened the nightstand drawer. Inside lay the folder, worn, yellowed at the edges, its corners curled from years of being handled and tucked away again. My fingers traced the cover before I lifted it out. Harold's handwriting still marked one corner. House Deed, Whitfield. I carried it downstairs with both hands, not like a weapon, but like a relic, because that's what it was, our life's work, the proof of years of sacrifice, the anchor that held me steady while everyone else tried to cast me adrift. When I reached the living room, the conversation stilled entirely. Even the children froze, sensing the gravity of the moment. I walked to the center of the room, to the coffee table littered with ribbons and half-empty glasses, and I placed the folder gently on its surface. "This," I said, my voice calm but carrying, "is the deed to this house." The words fell heavy into the silence. Mark barked a laugh, forced and brittle. "Oh, come on, that's just some old paperwork. Doesn't mean anything." I lifted the first page from the folder and turned it so everyone could see. The ink may have faded with time, but the names were clear. Harold Whitfield and Clara Whitfield, sole owners. No Linda, no Mark, just us. Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Taylor leaned forward, her eyes shining with vindication. A few guests exchanged wide-eyed glances. One even muttered under their breath, "I knew it." Linda stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Mom, why would you do this to me? Why would you humiliate me in front of everyone?" I looked at her steadily. "Humiliation comes not from truth, Linda, but from lies exposed. I didn't do this to you. You did it to yourself every time you claimed something that was never yours." Her lip quivered, but she said nothing. Mark, however, was not so easily silenced. He slammed his glass down on the table, the liquid sloshing onto the carpet. "This is insane. So what if your name's on some old piece of paper? We've lived here. We've paid for renovations. We've made this house what it is. That gives us the right. I let his words hang, then slowly shook my head. No, Mark. Sweat and money don't erase ink. This house was Harold's and mine before you even walked through its door, and it will remain mine until the day I decide otherwise. The children stared wide-eyed at the adults, their small hands clutching their toys, sensing the storm, even if they couldn't name it. One of them tugged at Linda's sleeve. "Mommy, what's happening?" Linda turned, her face red and streaked with shame, but she had no answer. The deed lay open on the table, undeniable. Every signature, every notarized stamp was a reminder that the story Linda and Mark had spun for years was built on nothing. I folded my hands in front of me, steady as stone. You told me I was only good for cleaning, that I was just here. But everything you have, everything you boast about stands on a foundation Harold and I built. You didn't respect that, and you didn't respect me. Now the truth has spoken. The silence was deafening. Guests shifted in their seats, eager to escape the tension but unable to move. The picture-perfect family Linda had crafted shattered in an instant, the shards glittering ugly beneath the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree. Finally, Mrs. Taylor broke the silence with a soft but firm voice. "Clara, you don't need to explain yourself. We all see now." Her words carried weight. Others nodded, murmuring agreement. For the first time that evening, the eyes in the room weren't mocking or dismissive. They were on me, steady and respectful. I closed the folder, slid it back toward me, and held it close. "This house is mine," I said quietly but firmly, "and from this day forward, nothing here happens without my say." Linda's face crumpled, shame and fury warring across her features. Mark clenched his fists, but he said nothing. He couldn't, not with the truth laid bare for all to see. And as I sat down in the chair Linda had once told me to give up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't forgotten. I was Clara Whitfield, and I had just taken back my place. The deed still sat on the coffee table, its ink a quiet witness to everything Linda and Mark had tried to erase. The guests who once laughed so freely now shifted uneasily, their voices low, their eyes darting between the three of us. What had been a holiday gathering was now a courtroom, and the verdict had already been delivered. Linda's hands trembled as she snatched up a wine glass. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice too sharp, too brittle. "So what if your name's on that paper? You think that makes you better than me? You think raising me, giving me this house, gives you the right to humiliate me in front of my friends?" She turned toward the others, her sequined sweater glittering as if trying to distract from the cracks in her composure. "You all know how much I do for her," she said, her words tumbling too fast. "I let her live here rent-free. I feed her, I take care of her, and this is how she repays me, by parading around like some queen in her old age." Her voice rose higher with each word until it cracked, and the silence that followed was heavy with judgment. Mrs. Taylor's voice cut through, calm but pointed. "Linda, your mother doesn't live here because you allow it. She lives here because it's her house. And from the way I've watched her treated tonight, I think we all see who's been doing the giving." Gasps rippled through the room. Some guests nodded, others whispered, but no one came to Linda's defense. Her face flushed crimson, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a retort. That's when Mark stepped in, his voice hard as stone. "Enough of this," he barked. He jabbed a finger toward me. "You think you're clever, Clara? Waving around some old papers like they mean something? Well, let me tell you, without us, this house is nothing. We paid for the new kitchen, the roof, the landscaping. We made it livable. You wouldn't last a month without us." I held his stare, calm and unwavering. "You confuse comfort with ownership, Mark. Renovations don't erase signatures. My name is the one on that deed, not yours, not Linda's, mine." His fists clenched at his sides. "Maybe so, but paper doesn't change reality. This is our home, and you," he sneered, "you're just an old woman clinging to the past, Nobody here takes you seriously." But the room proved him wrong. A murmur rose from the guests, soft but steady, like a tide rolling in. I caught words drifting through. Her house. Unbelievable. How could they treat her this way? Mark's eyes darted around, realizing too late that his audience wasn't with him anymore. His authority, built on arrogance and lies, crumbled under the weight of truth. Linda's desperation flared. "Mom, please," she hissed, her voice trembling now. "You can't do this. Not today, not on Christmas. Just let it go. We'll fix it later. Don't ruin everything." I leaned forward slightly, folding my hands in my lap, my voice steady and low. "Linda, I didn't ruin this day. You did. The moment you handed me that broom and told me I was good for nothing else, you made your choice. I stayed silent, but silence is not the same as weakness. And now, the truth is here. You can't sweep it aside like dust on the floor." The words hit her like a blow. Tears welled in her eyes, though whether from shame, anger, or both, I couldn't tell. Mark muttered something under his breath, too low for most to hear, but his glare burned hot enough. "You'll regret this, Clara." I straightened, my chin lifting. "No, Mark, the only regret here is yours, for thinking you could build a life on lies and entitlement. I don't need to raise my voice, the deed speaks louder than I ever could." The room was silent again, but this silence was different, charged, decisive. I wasn't the invisible old woman in the corner anymore. I was the rightful owner, the matriarch, the one whose truth had shattered their charade. Finally, a guest coughed awkwardly, muttered about needing to check on their casserole, and stood. One by one, the others followed, gathering coats, offering quick goodbyes. Their smiles were tight, their eyes avoiding Linda and Mark. But when they looked at me, there was respect. A quiet nod here, a soft "Merry Christmas" there. Linda stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides, her perfect holiday unraveling strand by strand. Mark muttered curses under his breath, his face dark with rage. And I? I sat in the very chair Linda had once told me to give up. The folder with the deed resting on my lap, my heart steady as stone. The public humiliation was complete, but justice wasn't finished. After the last guest slipped out the door, the house felt strangely hollow. The laughter, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, all gone. What remained was the thick silence of a battlefield after smoke has cleared. The tree lights still blinked in the corner, their cheer a cruel contrast to the storm that had passed. Linda stood by the mantel, her shoulders stiff, her eyes red-rimmed from tears she refused to let fall. Mark paced near the window like a caged animal, muttering curses under his breath, the anger rolling off him in waves. And I sat in the armchair by the coffee table, the deed still resting in my lap, my hands folded over it. My breathing was calm, steady, as though the house itself had shifted around me. For the first time in years, I wasn't the invisible figure in the corner. I was the one commanding the room. "Mom," Linda said finally, her voice breaking through the silence. "You didn't have to do this. Not today. Not in front of everyone." I lifted my gaze to hers. "Linda, you left me no choice. You've spent years treating me like a burden. Today you told me, in front of my grandchildren, that cleaning was all I was good for. Do you really believe I should have stayed silent forever?" She flinched, looking away. "I was just stressed. It was Christmas. Everything had to be perfect." "Perfect for who?" I asked. "For the neighbors? For Mark's friends? You forgot the one thing that mattered most: respect. You wanted me invisible, but this house, this family was built on my sacrifices. Without me, none of this would exist." Her lip trembled, but she didn't answer. Mark, however, couldn't keep quiet. "Enough of this self-righteous act," he snapped. "You've proven your point. Congratulations. You've embarrassed us, ruined our holiday, and humiliated Linda in front of everyone. What more do you want? You can't just kick us out. We have kids. We've built our lives here." I let his words hang in the air, heavy with accusation. Then slowly I shook my head. I'm not throwing anyone out tonight. This is still Christmas after all. But things will not go back to the way they were. From this moment forward, there are new rules. Linda looked up, startled. Rules? Yes. I straightened in my chair, my voice steady and firm. First, this is my home. That means decisions about bills, about renovations, about everything go through me. No more assumptions, no more boasts about ownership. My name is on the deed, and that is final. Mark scoffed, but I continued. Second, I will not be treated like a servant in my own house. I will not be ordered about, handed brooms, or spoken to like I am less than human. If I choose to cook, it is because I want to, not because I am expected to. If I choose to clean, it is by choice, not demand. From this day forward, you will speak to me as a mother, as a grandmother, and as the woman who built this home with her own hands. Linda swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Mark, then back to me. Third, I said, my tone sharpening, you will stop parading lies to neighbors and friends. This house is not yours, and anyone who asks will hear the truth. If you can't bear that, then perhaps you should consider finding your own place. But as long as you live here, you will live under my roof, my name, my rules. The silence after my words was deep and unbroken. The Christmas tree blinked quietly, the lights reflecting off the glass of the deed still open on my lap. Finally, Linda whispered, Mom, please, don't take everything away. The kids, they need this house. They need stability. I softened, just slightly. I won't take their home away. But Linda, stability isn't built on lies. It's built on truth, respect, and dignity. You've forgotten that. I haven't. Mark bristled, his fists clenched, but even he seemed to recognize the shift. His power had dissolved in front of witnesses. His threats meant nothing against ink on paper. I leaned back in the chair, closing the folder and holding it close. You wanted me invisible, but I'm here, and I will not disappear again. For a long time, no one spoke. Then from upstairs, the sound of children's laughter echoed down, a reminder that life moved on, even through the fractures. I closed my eyes briefly and let Harold's voice wash over me in memory. Truth always has its hour, Clara. And when it comes, stand tall. I had stood, and now the rules were mine. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. No clinking dishes, no forced laughter, no barking orders. The children tiptoed around as if they sensed the storm still hovering in the air. Linda barely looked at me when she passed through the kitchen, her face pale and puffy from a night of tears. She busied herself with dishes that didn't need washing, cupboards that didn't need sorting, anything to avoid my gaze. Mark, on the other hand, carried his anger openly. His footsteps were heavy, his voice sharp whenever he spoke to the children. He wouldn't meet my eyes, but I could feel his rage simmering like a kettle left on the stove. He was a man used to swagger and control, and last night had stripped that from him in front of everyone. He wouldn't forgive that easily. I sat at the table with a cup of tea, calm as ever, the deed folder beside me. I didn't flaunt it, didn't wave it in their faces. Its presence alone was enough. The hours stretched, quiet but taut. Linda avoided me, Mark stewed, and the children clung to their toys, sensing more than they understood. By the second day, I knew silence wouldn't be enough. Arrogance like Mark's doesn't dissolve, it festers. And Linda, my Linda, she was too tangled in his influence to stand on her own. If I wanted to protect what Harold and I built, I couldn't simply rely on paper tucked in a drawer. I needed something stronger, something legal, undeniable, permanent. So I made an appointment. The following week, I sat in a lawyer's office downtown, the winter sunlight spilling through the blinds. The man across from me was young, but his eyes were sharp. I slid the deed across the desk, my hand steady. I need to make sure, I told him, that this house remains mine, that no one, not my daughter, not her husband, can strip me of it while I'm still breathing. He studied the papers carefully, then nodded. Mrs. Whitfield, your ownership is secure, but if you'd like, we can update your will, add stipulations, even file notices that will make it impossible for them to act without your consent. I nodded. Do it all. We spent hours drafting documents, each one another layer of armor around the life Harold and I had built. I made decisions I hadn't thought I'd ever need to, ensuring the grandchildren would inherit what was left, not Linda or Mark. I gave instructions that if anything happened to me, the house would be sold and placed in a trust for the children's education. When I left the office, the folder under my arm felt heavier, not with burden, but with power. Back at the house, the tension remained thick. Linda still avoided my gaze, moving through the rooms as though on eggshells. Mark's smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by a brooding silence that was almost worse. He stayed late at work, came home late, his presence more shadow than substance. The neighbors, though, they knew. They called, dropped by, even pulled me aside at the grocery store. "Clara, you handled yourself beautifully," Mrs. Taylor said one afternoon. "You didn't even raise your voice, and yet you said everything." I smiled softly. Sometimes truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand. But inside, I knew the battle wasn't finished. Linda's pride was wounded, and Mark's arrogance was cornered. Cornered animals lash out. That's why I'd gone to the lawyer, because I wasn't naive enough to think a single night's humiliation would cure years of entitlement. At dinner that night, Linda finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, brittle. "Mom, what happens now?" I set down my fork and looked at her. "Now, Linda, we live together with respect. If that isn't possible, then you and Mark will need to find another place. I won't be erased in my own home again." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, unable to argue. Mark slammed his fork down, muttered something about ungrateful old women, and left the table. I didn't flinch, because for the first time in years, I wasn't the one walking away from the table in silence. I was the one setting it. A week passed after Christmas, and though the decorations still hung on the walls, the spirit of the season had vanished. The house felt quieter, almost reverent, as though even the walls recognized that something had shifted. Linda moved around me carefully, her steps soft, her words muted. She was still my daughter, but she looked at me differently now, not with the dismissive glance of someone seeing a burden, but with the wary respect of someone who'd been reminded of where she came from. She didn't say much, but silence has many faces, and hers was no longer filled with arrogance. It was filled with shame. Mark, on the other hand, remained defiant. He spent longer hours away from the house, stomping in late at night, his presence a storm that the rest of us learned to endure. But his words grew fewer, his jabs quieter. He had learned, in the most humiliating way, that this was not his domain. The grandchildren were the light that broke through it all. Little Emma climbed into my lap one evening as I read by the fireplace, her voice soft. "Grandma, is this your house?" I closed my book and smiled at her. "Yes, sweetheart, it always has been." She tilted her head, her curls falling into her eyes. "Then why did Mommy say it was hers?" I brushed the hair back gently. "Sometimes people forget the truth. Sometimes they want things to be theirs so badly that they pretend. But the truth doesn't change, Emma. It just waits until the right time to be seen." Her eyes widened in the way only a child's can. "Like a secret?" I chuckled softly. "Yes, darling. A very important secret." She leaned against me, satisfied with the answer, and within minutes was asleep in my arms. I watched the fire crackle, the warmth spreading through the room, and I thought of Harold, how proud he would have been to see that even in betrayal, dignity could be reclaimed. The days that followed were filled with small but meaningful changes. I was no longer handed chores like a servant. No one shoved a broom into my hands. When meals were cooked, I was asked if I wanted a seat at the table first, not last. When decisions were discussed, about bills, about school schedules, I was included, not excluded. It wasn't perfect. The wounds Linda had caused ran deep, and Mark's bitterness clung to him like a second skin. But for me, the shift was enough. Respect had returned, however reluctantly. And once respect is reclaimed, it cannot easily be taken again. One afternoon I walked through the yard, the winter air sharp against my cheeks. The calm roses I had planted decades ago were bare now, their branches brittle in the cold. But I knew, come spring, they would bloom again. That's the way of life, seasons of barrenness followed by seasons of growth. I thought about my life, about Harold, about the years of sacrifice, and about that Christmas morning when my daughter shoved a broom into my hands as if that was all I had left to give. And then I thought about the knock at the door, the officers, the deed laid bare for all to see. The contrast was sharp, from invisibility to undeniable truth. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet, the children asleep upstairs. Linda lingered in the doorway, her face tired. She didn't speak at first, but then she whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom." I looked at her, searching her eyes. She meant it, or at least part of her did. The rest would take time. "You don't owe me words, Linda," I said gently. "You owe me respect. Show me that, and it will be enough." She nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes, and then she slipped away. As I folded the deed back into its folder and tucked it safely into the drawer once more, I felt no triumph, no gloating, only peace. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to see them broken. I only needed to see the truth acknowledged, respect restored, dignity reclaimed. On Christmas morning, they had tried to reduce me to nothing more than a broom in my hands. But by that evening, I had shown them, shown everyone, that I was far more than that. I was Clara Whitfield, wife, mother, teacher, builder of this home, keeper of its truth, and as long as I drew breath, no one would take that from me again. Weeks slipped by after that Christmas morning, but the memory lingered like a scar, tender, visible, unforgettable. The decorations slowly came down, the tree dragged to the curb, the ornaments packed away in boxes. Yet the shift in this house could not be packed away so neatly. Life resumed, but it was not the same. Linda spoke softer now, her voice stripped of its edge. She still avoided long conversations with me. But when our eyes met, I saw something new, something fragile. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was no longer contempt. It was awareness, maybe even the beginning of respect. Mark remained distant, his pride too bruised to recover. He went about the house like a man who no longer recognized the walls around him, muttering about work, about bills, about everything except the truth that had unseated him. His arrogance had been dragged into the light, and he had no words to cover its nakedness. The children, though, they were different. They clung to me now, slipping into my room to hear bedtime stories, to ask questions about their grandfather, to sit by my side as I knitted by the fire. One evening, little Emma brought me a picture she'd drawn, a house with flowers blooming in the yard, her and her brother holding my hands at the front door. At the top, she'd written in crooked letters, Grandma's house. I held that paper to my chest, tears pricking my eyes. "Yes," I whispered to her. "That's exactly what it is." Neighbors never forgot either. When I walked to the store, people greeted me differently. There was a weight in their nods, a respect that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Taylor stopped me outside the post office one afternoon, her gloved hand warm as it squeezed mine. "You reminded all of us, Clara," she said. "Respect isn't given, it's claimed. You claimed yours, and you did it with dignity." I smiled softly, the winter air sharp in my lungs. "Sometimes dignity is the only weapon we have left," I told her. Inside the house, small victories grew. No one shoved chores into my hands anymore. No one mocked me with jokes about being a maid. When bills came, they were placed on the table, and Linda asked, almost shyly, "Mom, should we go over these together?" It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall of arrogance she and Mark had built. I knew things would never be perfect. Mark would always carry his resentment, and Linda's shame would take time to heal. But perfection wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was recognition. What I wanted was respect. What I wanted was to know that my years of sacrifice hadn't been erased by arrogance and entitlement. And now I had that. One night, as the snow fell gently outside, I sat by the fire with the deed folder resting on my lap. I didn't need to open it anymore. Its truth was already written in the air we breathed, in the way the house shifted around me. Harold's voice came to me again, steady and sure. "Truth always has its hour, Clara." I closed my eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire, the soft sound of children's laughter drifting from upstairs. My heart ached for the years lost to silence, to invisibility, but it also swelled with pride, because I had stood, I had reclaimed what was mine. Linda's words on Christmas morning would never leave me. "Clean up, that's all you're good for." They had cut deep, but they had also sharpened me. They had reminded me that even in the face of betrayal, dignity is not something that can be given or taken. It is something you hold on to even when others try to strip it away. And so I sat in my chair, warm by the fire, the house quiet and steady around me. My house. My legacy. On Christmas morning, they had tried to bury me under shame. But by evening, I had risen with truth. And that truth would outlast them all.